Good morning. The theme for our lectures this year is the environment. Bennett Johnson, our past program chair, chose this subject because of all the environmental challenges we face as citizens of the world. In the United States, we are so very fortunate to have a national park system that reminds us how beautiful and breathtaking our world can be. Today, our speaker, Jamie Allen, will highlight the role that photographers played in the development of these national treasures. Jamie Allen earned her BA in art history and a BFA in photography from the University of Arizona, Tucson, and an MA in photographic preservation and collections management from Ryerson University in coordination with the George Eastman Museum. She has authored a number of books and essays, and she is currently a curator at the George Eastman Museum in Rochester, New York, which is one of the world's oldest museums dedicated to photography. I should mention that one of Jamie's exhibits is currently at the Krannert Art Museum in Champaign. The exhibit is a retrospective of the 50-year career of Bea Nettles and her experimental approaches to photography. Today's lecture on the national parks grew out of Jamie's exhibit called Photography in America's National Parks, which brought together some of the finest landscape photos in the history of photography. Jamie's book, Picturing America's National Parks, is the perfect companion for today's lecture. I recommend this book for anyone interested in photography or our national parks. I've purchased many photography books over the years, and this is one of the best. So it's our great fortune today to welcome our speaker, Jamie Allen.
And America's national parks grew kind of side by side. They fed each other in some ways. And really, photography played a big role in our understanding of these natural spaces and promoting them as spaces that we wanted to preserve for perpetuity for our country, but also in kind of developing how we looked at these spaces. So I want to touch on some of that today. And as Tom mentioned, the book did grow out of an exhibition called Photography in America's National Parks. And then I was working with Aperture on another book at the time, and they said, well, what's your next project? And I said, Photography in America's National Parks. You know, it's 100th anniversary coming up in 2016 of when that Park Service was created. So we really wanted to look at that, and they said, let's do that as a book. So we made this book on a pretty short time schedule, and it's a really beautiful just kind of take on looking at those two things growing side by side, photography and the national park system. Now the book itself is in chronological order, which I think for a book is a great way to approach things. But today I wanted to look at the kind of subject in the way that the exhibition was presented. So it kind of had four topic areas. One is Yosemite Valley, and that kind of serves as a way to kind of get an overview of all the different areas that come next, which is exploration, tourism, and then art and advocacy. So those are the areas that we're going to focus on today. So Yosemite, everybody will say, that's not the first national park, Jamie. And you were absolutely correct. Yosemite was not the first national park. Yellowstone is the first national park created in 1872. But Yosemite is an interesting space because it's actually designated as a wilderness space in preservation in 1864 by Abraham Lincoln. So let's look at how that happened, because I think the idea that we're setting aside a space for people to enjoy wilderness really starts with this idea of Yosemite. So the first photographer to come to the Yosemite Valley is Charles Leander Weed. And he's left out of a lot of the histories, mostly because Weed's photographs are published in magazines, they're published as stereo views by other publishers, and he never gets credit. His name never appears alongside those images. So most images that we see with Charles Leander Weed's name on them say attributed to him because we're We're never 100% sure that it's Weed's image because we never see his name appear alongside. But he comes to the Yosemite Valley in 1859, working for Hutchins California magazine. And his goal with that is to image this space so that the magazine can create a series of articles about the Yosemite Valley and kind of publish those images. The images within that are translated into wood engravings. So because at that time you can't publish a photograph in a magazine or a book, but we can kind of trace back and see the images that he made in 1859 and how they appeared in that magazine, in that very first kind of take on this valley that's put out in a published material. He's working with something that we would call a mammoth plate view, so something pretty large in scale. And he goes back into the valley later on in 1865 to make both those mammoth plate large kind of views as well as stereo views. And I'll touch on all of those technologies here in a moment. In his first trip in 1859, he makes 60 different plates of the Yosemite Valley, 20 of which are published in that magazine between 1859 and 1860. So really just the first take on looking at this space that's completely unexplored at this point in time. But Carleton Watkins gets all the glory. He's the one that everybody really says is the first photographer in the Yosemite Valley. And he goes there in 1861 with a custom mammoth plate camera that's an 18 by 22 inch camera. So here I want to explain a little bit about photography at this moment in time, because it's quite different than picking up your phone and snapping a photograph today. So at that point in time, you have a camera that must have a glass plate negative in the back of it. So you're actually having a giant glass plate that will then be in contact with that final piece of paper that you're going to print your photograph on. So when I say he has an 18 by 22 inch camera, the glass plate is 18 by 22 inches. And he's out there in the wilderness coating it with this wet, sticky substance called collodion. It's kind of syrupy, and he has to coat that plate with collodion, dip it into a silver nitrate bath in the dark out there in the wilderness, get that wet plate into his camera, and while it's still wet, expose his view in his camera, then take that plate back to the dark room that he's got out there in the wilderness, develop it, fix it, and dry it, and then stick it in a box and carry it around while he's going around making other images. Not easy. And all the accounts say that Watkins had a lot of mules that would help him carry around his equipment. One account says he had 12 different mules to get his equipment to the Yosemite Valley, and 5 mules that carried his glass plates, chemistry, and his darkroom tent around with him as he explored the valley and made these views. So not an easy way to go, because there's no roads yet, there's no infrastructure within that valley. So he's really just wandering around trying to explore and find spaces that are good picturesque views. And that's something I think is really important, because Watkins' views, and I'm going to show you some examples here in a little bit, but Watkins' views really establish these points that are the views that we still go to today when we visit that valley. So photography not only is capturing this wild area, but telling us how we should be looking at it, where we should stand in order to get the best view. Now, Watkins' images in 1861 are printed as large photographs and sent to politicians who then use those photographs to lobby for this space to be set aside and preserved. And that is how the Yosemite Grant Act in 1864 ends up coming into being and signed by Abraham Lincoln, and setting these lands aside to be preserved by the state of California. So at that point, those lands become kind of the subject of the state of California, and they're responsible for preserving them so that all can enjoy those spaces. So a little later on, Eadweard Muybridge goes there, and Muybridge is probably best known for his photographs capturing horses running in motion. or his motion studies, where he's capturing things in motion and different points so you get a sense of how animals and people move. But he's really a wonderful landscape photographer as well. And his photographs in the Yosemite Valley start in 1867, again, much before any sort of easy way to get to that valley. And at that point in time, things like this, a stereo card, were very popular because people on the East Coast really wanted to see these lands and see these wilderness spaces and understand them. But they couldn't get there. There was no easy way to travel to these spaces. Even if you lived in the state of California, it was hard to get to these spaces and travel around because, again, no infrastructure. So everybody was an armchair traveler. You would have your photographs and you would look at them. And stereo views are wonderful because you can see things in 3 dimensions. So if you have kind of typical eyesight and you do that right, left kind of view, that's exactly how a stereo camera works. So a stereo camera has 2 lenses on the front, has its plate in the back, and it's recording 2 simultaneous images. One's that like right view and one's the left view. And it's really hard to show stereo views in an exhibition. And I'm really lucky to have a colleague who's obsessed with stereo views, so that she made this wonderful stereo viewer that people could experience these things much like they would have with the left-hand view in their own parlors in the 1800s. So for today's lecture, I made some GIFs, and you'll see a couple more throughout the lecture, so that it just flashes the 2 images slightly back and forth, hopefully giving you a sense of that 3-dimensional quality that you would get if you were looking at this through a stereo viewer. So I'll just do that one more time. And I think what's really important about stereo photography at this point in time, so most of these photographers I'm talking about, Watkins, Muybridge, and later photographers, are going to the valley with multiple cameras. They have their mammoth plate view, they have their stereo view, and in Muybridge's case, he also had a boudoir camera, which was about a 5x8 size view, so that they're creating different products. They're kind of got this low-end stereo view size, the boudoir size maybe a little bit fancier, and the mammoth plate for people who are quite wealthy or for lobbying politicians and such. So all these different sizes of views that are being made. It becomes a really booming business though. And so photographers start to flood that area, but really these photographers are the main ones that we see throughout the history. Now, Muybridge is known also for something else, and that is printing in clouds. So if you look at these 2 images, they're the same landscape. They have different clouds, and the clouds are something that the wet plate collodion negative process, they couldn't record the clouds or the sky and the land at the same time very well. So essentially, if you wanted a good image of the land, the sky was completely blank white. It just overexposed it completely. And if you wanted a good picture of the sky, the land was super underexposed and just didn't have any details and wasn't very good. So to accomplish this, he's making a nice image of the landscape and then images of the clouds. And then as he's printing them, he's using those two negatives to make a full image, which can result in things like this, these anomalies where we see different clouds over the same exact landscape. So he's constructing these views in some way. It wasn't seen as lying or anything like that in the 19th century. It was just really helping him make this beautiful atmospheric view. And that was really important for Muybridge, is he wanted to show the atmosphere that you get from these really high up vantage points within that valley. So he has a lot of smoky, cloudy views. Now, by the time that we do start to get some infrastructure and people are able to make it to the valley, we start to have people who capitalize on the idea that tourists are coming to these spaces, and tourists don't yet have their own cameras. That's not introduced until 1888. So if they go to the valley, they want to buy something, a photographic view that they can take home and paste in their album or have so that they have that memory of that space. So George Fisk and his wife actually visited the Yosemite Valley for about 3 years between 1879 and 1881. And Fisk realizes that this would be a booming business. So they come back in 1883. I want to make sure I had the right date there. 1883, and establish a business on the floor of the Yosemite Valley, so that they can be basically photographers right there selling their photographs right there in the valley. You don't have to go back to San Francisco or some other place to buy your images. You can do it right there when you're visiting and as a tourist in that spot. I'm just going to point out quickly that this print is a later print by Ansel Adams, because George Fisk's studio, I believe, burnt down the space that had a lot of his prints, but Ansel Adams was able to recover some of the negatives and made prints from them. So this is a later print made by Ansel Adams, which is why the color isn't quite what it would have been if it had been printed by Fisk. And fun stories. I love fun stories. Fisk was really well known for having a wheelbarrow that he'd put his camera and equipment in and run around the valley. And by the time Fisk is there, we now have a dry plate process. So he doesn't quite have to have all the same chemistry. He can just take his glass plates and his camera and his tripod and go out into the wilderness and make an image, and then bring those plates back to his studio to develop and print them. So it's a little bit easier, but still a lot of equipment that you're carrying around, and still carrying around glass plates. And Fisk is also noted because he's one of the first people to winter in the valley. He's noted for making winter views, the first winter views of Yosemite. Now, Fisk isn't the only person who realized that the tourist trade and capitalizing on it would be a great idea. Another gentleman named Henry Best also did that and established a studio. Best was a painter and a cartoonist, and he and his wife made a studio in Yosemite Valley and would go there every summer and again sell his paintings and his cartoons to the people who came as tourists. But the reason Best is important is because of another young man who he becomes acquainted with named Ansel Adams. So Ansel Adams first goes to the Yosemite Valley I want to make sure I have the right date. And I don't think I have it on this piece of paper, but Ansel Adams is there as the here it is, 1920, as the caretaker for the Sierra Club's LeConte Memorial Lodge. And so he's just a young guy there taking care of the space. He becomes very interested in preservation, which I'll talk about in a minute. So he's the person who basically goes and puts the rope up the side of Half Dome so that tourists can go and start to climb up the side of it in the early spring. So that's his job at that moment in time. And Ansel Adams becomes acquainted with Harry Best's daughter, Virginia, and they end up marrying in 1829. And once that happens, Ansel Adams, he also is now interested in photography and makes views. And his photographs then start to be sold out of Harry Best's studio. So now he's a photographer making views, and his work starts to be well known that way. And that's really where he gets his start making photographs of these national park spaces. Later on, Ansel Adams and Virginia Adams inherit that studio, and that studio still is in existence today. It's now known as the Ansel Adams Gallery. Like I said, I think it's really important to acknowledge that the views that we make and that later photographers make are really the views that the first people who go to a space make. So here's a good series of El Capitan. And on the left, we have Carleton Watkins, who we talked about as kind of the first person who's establishing those really classical views of the space. C.R. Savage, who's just like another person who comes in and tries to take hold of that tourist, or not tourist, the booming trade in publishing images of the space. A postcard from the 1920s or 30s of that exact same view. And then on the right, an Ansel Adams photograph of El Capitan. So you can see that kind of direct lineage of we've established a view and we just keep making the same thing over and over again with whatever process we're using at that moment in time. And I'm sure if I went to somebody's Instagram feed and looked at El Capitan, I'd find this exact same image. So here's a good example of an artist who's now returned to that space. And Binh Don is a Vietnamese American photographer who's now based out of Arizona. But Binh Don, his family came to the United States during the Khmer Rouge that happened in Vietnam in the 1975, 1979 kind of era. And he came to the United States as a very young child at the age of like 2 or 3. And he often looks at his photographs as a way to kind of rectify his relationship as an immigrant to this country. And so he knew the Yosemite Valley through photographs, but had never been there. So he took his daguerreotype camera, and I'm just going to point out that daguerreotype E predates all the processes that we've already talked about. It's one of the very first photographic processes. And there's kind of this effort right now by some photographers to use historic processes. So he's using this historic process. And daguerreotypes are quite unique because they have a very mirror-like surface. And you can see yourself in them. So you physically see yourself in that landscape when you view this object, which is a really beautiful thing that Binh Don wants you to do. He wants you to think about your relationship to this natural space that's been set aside for national purposes. And just quickly to show you, now Binh Don's image is laterally reversed, meaning that left to right, it's kind of flipped. But this again is Carleton Watkins' view and Binh Don's view of the same space, basically the same view in different processes from different eras. So now that we've sort of looked at the arc of how all these things come together, I want to talk about the era of exploration in these spaces. And one of the first exploration projects that happens is Josiah Dwight Whitney leads the state of California's geology area from 1860 to 1874. And he's charged with recording all of the most important spaces and showing kind of the gems of nature that happen in California. So he hires Carleton Watkins to go and make images, and Watkins ends up having his photographs printed in this book called the Yosemite Book that Whitney writes. So Whitney's prose is published both in the Yosemite Book alongside Watkins' tipped-in photographs, actual photographs in that book. Very few copies of that in existence. And then Whitney's text is also printed as a tourist guide for people who want to go to that space and understand that space and know how to maneuver and enjoy that space. But what's really interesting about the Yosemite Book and Whitney's writing is that he is the first person to use the term national park. So the term national park really comes from this book, predating, again, any actual national park that we have, just looking at those ideas of creating a space for public enjoyment. Another important survey that happened was through the government's process of looking at the American West and its resources. And so George Wheeler was one of the government officials that was charged with going and exploring those areas. And he was charged with going west of the 100th meridian. And so this morning I realized that that's a really weird concept, the 100th meridian. So I popped this in really quickly so we could all get a sense of where the 100th meridian is and think of what's west of that. And so it's really, he's looking at Arizona and Colorado, and specifically a lot of the canyons in Colorado, Utah, and Arizona is what his exploration really is founded in. And so he hires a photographer named William Bell, along with others. But Bell's views are really lovely. I think of them as this idea of like, I've approached this landscape and I'm totally alien to it, and it's really crazy and monumental, and how do I capture that? So I love these details of he's looking from underneath, kind of up at the space, with that overhanging cliff, because you're down in the valley. It really shows the monumentality of those spaces. And these images are printed as etchings within his Wheeler's progress report that goes to Congress, and again, is used not actually to set these spaces aside as parks or anything, but they're actually, those progress reports are used to show that we should do more exploration and actually do more to record these spaces before westward expansion really takes hold. But William Bell's photographs are also printed as albumin silver prints that go then to Congress as well. And I really think that albumin silver prints probably were convincing for them that we should fund these these exploration projects and continue to do those kinds of projects. I wanted to show you a side-by-side view of the photograph and the etching because they're really a little bit different. I think the etching has a little bit more detail and kind of a lightness to it, whereas the photograph has a little bit more of a foreboding feeling. So I wanted to give you a sense of how those two processes really interpret that space differently, even though they're made from the same negative. Another project that happens is in the 1870s. Ferdinand Vanderveer Hayden is invited to do a geological and geographic survey of the territories. And this really covers the area that's around the Grand Tetons, and the Yellowstone was now Yellowstone National Park. And I think this project really helps to make Yellowstone happen as a national park and really start that progress. And again, he's there in the 1870s. That park is founded in 1872 when this photograph was made. William Henry Jackson's photographs of that space, I think because of Yellowstone and its unique features, really focus on those really unique features. So how do you capture something like Old Faithful or a hot spring, which looks like a very foreign kind of landscape to anybody on the East Coast who hasn't seen this kind of bubbling hot geyser or that kind of landscape. So how do you capture that in a photograph? So his photographs focus on these natural phenomena. And one of the things that happens is that the painter Thomas Moran is invited to join that survey so that he can make a monumental painting. And this isn't necessarily that one monumental painting. He made a lot of paintings of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, but I wanted to show you an example of what that looks like. But he and Jackson worked side by side so that Jackson was making photographs that could help Thomas Moran with his painting. So he's using William Henry Jackson's photographs to seed his work as a painter. And it's really William Henry Jackson's work and Thomas Moran's paintings that convinced people that this space should be set aside as a national park. Thomas Moran also joins another survey project, which is exploring the areas around the Grand Canyon again. And this one is led by John Wesley Powell in 1871. For that project, Powell hired several photographers, and this photographer, John K. Hillers, and I'm going to quickly point out before I leave this slide that that's Thomas Moran standing, probably pointing to a photographer or another artist, showing what view he wants them to capture. But so Hillers actually starts off as a boatman for the project. He's there, and if you think about all those valleys, the way that they are exploring them is they're in boats going down. So again, carrying all that equipment in boats and having a dark room, and that's actually what we see here is that little tent in that boat is his dark room. Not a lot of space to do all that work that he needed to do. So as a boatman, he starts to be an assistant for the photographers, and then the next year, John K. Hillers is the photographer for that project. And again, I'll just show you the 3D view. So Hiller's photographs, I think, are unique because he begins to include people in his views. And this is something that had been happening with images of the Middle East. If you think of the Sphinx or the pyramids, how do you show the monumentality of such a structure without a person in the view to show you how big it is? And Hillers is really the first person who takes that sublime landscape and breaks it and puts a person in there, showing that kind of human relationship to the landscape. So I wanted to be sure to include this Now, John Weasley Powell's team for the Geographical and Geological Survey of the Rocky Mountain region did result in a lot of images. And even though Thomas Moran made a painting related to this project as well, the Grand Canyon did not get established as a national park until 1919. So this is one space that kind of lagged behind, and there's lots of reasons for that, mostly mining and things like that that hold up that process. And just quickly, I wanted to give you a view from the book and let you know that in the book, there's a lot of timelines that happen so that you can see the progress of the national parks being developed right alongside the progress that's happening in photography. Just kind of laid out in some dates and information in that way. So now I want to talk a little bit about tourism, because once all those exploration projects take hold, and after the Civil War in the 1870s, the railroads are built and all that infrastructure comes in, now people can get to these spaces and they want photographs. And as I said, they don't have their own cameras at the beginning. So how are they going to get these views? So people like George Fisk and F.J. Haynes, who's actually in the photograph here. The photograph is made by his son, Jack Ellis Haynes, but Frank J. Haynes really he's a unique figure in this history. So I want to kind of talk about him a little bit here. But he essentially starts going to Yellowstone and making views as part of a project that he is doing for the Northern Pacific Railroad. And his project for that railroad is to document what the railroad can do. Why would you want to take this railroad? Where is it going to take you and what are you going to see? And one of those end stages is what is now Yellowstone National Park. So as he's making that project, he realizes that nobody's there in Yellowstone to make the views that people are going to want at the end of that journey. So he actually writes to the Department of the Interior requesting an exclusive lease at Mammoth Hot Springs and the rights to be the sole photographer in that area. And he is granted a lease there. He's not really granted all the rights that he wants, but he calls himself the official photographer of Yellowstone National Park. And really, he is one of the few individuals in that valley. Ends up making a lot of different shops throughout the valley, throughout that park for people to come and make and take and purchase views. I should say purchase views. So I love this image because it gives us a sense of how people originally traveled around Yellowstone. You would get in your stagecoach and go off for the day to a specific site and then come back to your hotel. And so he is very much part of that tourist trade as both a photographer and a tour guide. And his images, again, focus on the spaces that people are visiting and often put people within those spaces, because if you think about a tourist taking these home to somebody, they want that idea that they were in the space. But he doesn't have the ability to make unique images of each individual. So these kind of vague figures in the landscape. And again, here's the 3D view of that. I think now all of these areas have a lot of planks, kind of boardwalks that you walk on, but here people are walking right up to these geysers. I would not want to be that close to a hot geyser personally. Haynes comes up with a lot of different products that he can sell, from stereo views and just plain photographs to these kind of higher end photo reviewer books that people can take home with them to show what they experienced in that space. And again, his son also becomes part of the business. And so the Haynes studio actually is really one of the only places or only photographer studios in that space making views for tourists up until 1966. And this is a postcard. And I think this postcard is interesting because it's not showing the natural spaces, it's showing the kind of the benefits of being at the hotels and the dining areas at at the sites, because by this point in time in 1940, you can make your own photograph as a tourist, and we'll get there also in a moment. Now, when roads come in and the national highway system comes in and cars really take hold and car culture really takes hold, this is where the national parks really take off. So we're looking at kind of the 1920s at this point. Now there's that idea of an epic family journey of taking a car ride to a national park and enjoying nature. And what are you going to get on the far end of that? And what spaces will you experience, and how will you experience it? So through these postcards that are often published by the hotels and the tourist kind of chains themselves, that's what you get. You get a sense of exactly what it is that you will experience. Here's what your car will look like in the Yosemite or at Zion National Park. Here is the roadway in Bryce Canyon. Here is the chalet that you will get at Glacier National Park. So these really wonderful tourist sites and views. And the other thing that postcards can do at this point in time that photography can't is they can add color to these spaces, which many of these areas are really rich in color. Another thing that happens is, again, kind of a marketing campaign. So if you think of Esso, which for anybody who doesn't know is the ExxonMobil Corporation now, Esso made kind of little films to help promote both their product, but also the national parks. And Shenandoah National Park is a really unique park because it's made specifically to drive through. A lot of the parks are made so that you can get out and experience kind of nature itself, but Shenandoah is really made as a driving park. It's really heavy on car culture and the idea that you're going to drive through and enjoy the space. And this particular marketing campaign video really does just that. You are in the car enjoying the views. And I have somewhat recently visited Shenandoah, and having seen this film, I knew exactly what to expect and how to enjoy it. Although I didn't have a convertible. Oh well. Snapshots, again, are another really important way that tourists experience the space. And on the farthest left here, we have one of the earliest kinds of snapshots. In 1888, Eastman Kodak Company introduced a box camera that would make 100 views. So 100 negatives. You would then send your whole camera back to the company. They develop the negatives, print all the photographs, package them back up, refill your camera with film, and send it back to you. And those early ones have this kind of circular appeal to them, if you will. They have this kind of vignette that happens over them. It's estimated that within the first 10 years that these cameras were introduced, 1.5 million snapshots were made in the United States, which is kind of a mind-blowing number thinking about how these cameras really were a somewhat high-end product at that time. So now that people can make their own views, that's how you see some of those other tourist images that are being sold by publishers start to change. And again, I love the idea that, you know, William Henry Jackson would have made a view of this geyser. And now as a tourist, you know, or F.J. Haynes would have taken you there, and now you can go and make a photograph of it yourself. And we get that same view over and over and over again, each era of photography. And in the book, there's this really lovely kind of series of Waiwana Tunnel in the Yosemite Valley. And again, that idea that as a culture, we know where to stop and take a photograph because of just the cues that are around us and the spaces that within the parks now. This is where a parking lot is. There must be something here that I should see. So everybody kind of making the same image. And we included some Instagram photos. And so I want to point out in particular this one up on the upper right, because that is that same Wawona Tunnel view of somebody within that landscape enjoying it. And we wanted to extend the book through Instagram because that is really one of the main ways that people share their views, and those same kind of impetus of recording the space that you've been in and sharing it with others. And now we have this really simple way to do that with social media. And there's some kind of kitsch things that happen. People like to do things like put their sandwich or whatever they're holding into the landscape, like we see on the left. Have your shadow included in the image so that you are kind of a self-portrait within there. There's a real strange phenomena in my head of people doing yoga poses in specific within the landscape, or this idea that you're sort of balancing on the lip or edge of a space, and just being in that grandeur. So lots of different kinds of ways that people have started to include themselves in the images that they make. I wanted to speak briefly about this Arthur Rothstein image of Rocky Mountains in Rocky Mountain National Park, because when I first approached it, I thought, oh, this must be an art image. And the more research I did, I realized that it was actually made for Look magazine to be part of this kind of touristy article about Colorado. And if you were to visit Colorado, what would you have the opportunity to enjoy there? So I just thought it was really interesting that the way that we view photographs and the context that we understand them in can really change our understanding of why a photograph was made. And so just having that little bit of research, it really changed my understanding of this image and what its intended purpose was. It wasn't that kind of Ansel Adams pure enjoyment of the landscape per se. It was really to promote people to go and visit this space. So to have that alluring landscape that would get people over to Colorado. So with that, I want to segue into the last section, which is art and advocacy. And in this section, I just wanted to show the beautiful images of the spaces that we see. So in this one, we have Alvin Langdon Coburn, who is really a tourist, but he is a established photographer at this point in time. And he's traveling with Arthur Wesley Dow, the artist. And they are going through, they go to the Yosemite Valley, they go to Mariposa Grove, and they go to the Grand Canyon. And I love these side-by-side views of Alvin Langdon Coburn's kind of very finished photograph and Arthur Wesley Dow's kind of snapshot that he made of the snow-covered Grand Canyon. Coburn is part of the movement that we call pictorialism, where a lot of people think of kind of a soft focus or sometimes narratives, sometimes kind of mythological figures like nymphs and things in the images. But really the idea of pictorialism is art for art's sake. Really, how can photographs be a unique object equal to a painting, equal to a sculpture, so that we can show off photography and its skills as an artist. And the focus ultimately becomes on the individual who's making the photograph and printing the photograph. So I wanted to show you a painting by Arthur Wesley Dow of the same subject, just to give you an idea that it's possible that he was making his snapshots to feed his photographs a little bit like Thomas Moran. Another pictorialist at the beginning of her career is Imogen Cunningham. And I have to show this one because it's one of my favorite photographs in the entire exhibition. I love how the space is flattened and it's very much inspired by something like a Japanese woodblock print. And here we're looking at Mount Rainier, but really Mount Rainier is that tiny mountain in the background. And most of what we're seeing is the side of this glacier and just the beautiful undulations of the space that are made within her platinum print. And she was really a master platinum printer. She wrote a dissertation on the platinum process and became very well known for it. But this image foreshadows her involvement in a group called F64, which was a West Coast modernist photography group. And probably the best known member of that group was Ansel Adams. And Ansel Adams, he became enamored with the idea of preservation and preserving landscapes after reading James Mason Hutchings' book, and it's a 496-page book. He read it at the age of 14, which I think is I can't even imagine reading something that long as a 14-year-old. But the book is called In the Heart of the Sierras, and it's really about the Sierra Nevada area in California. And at 14, Ansel Adams reads this book and convinces his parents to take him there. And he has a little Brownie snapshot camera and he makes some views. And that is really how he becomes enamored with making photographs of the landscape. He then again becomes part of the Sierra Club and becomes the caretaker of the lodge at Yosemite, at which point after which he becomes an established photographer. And at some point, he actually, in 1941, he's invited to participate in a project by the government to photograph all of the national parks. And he takes on this project. And by 1942, because of World War II, the Secretary of the Interior has to cancel that project. But Ansel Adams sort of carries on traveling to the spaces on his own and making photographs that really record the grandeur of the American landscape. And Ansel Adams is such a big figure that in the exhibition, I had to have a whole case of these objects that we have related to him. So he and his wife, Virginia, made the illustrated guide to the Yosemite Valley. He kind of self-published this book called My Camera in the National Parks, of which one of the images is shown on the upper right there. On the lower part, he and his wife collaborated on a children's book about the Yosemite Valley that showcases their children enjoying the spaces. I'll just note that's El Capitan with children, same view that we saw before. And then his images are even used on a U-Bahn coffee can. So his images really proliferate into the world through all these different products that he is making and using to promote his photography. Cunningham and Ansel Adams and Eadweard Weston, again, were all part of that group F64. And F64 refers to the aperture of a camera lens, and it's the smallest aperture that you can get, which gives you the most focus. So as opposed to pictorialism, where things, like I said, people often think of them as soft and fuzzy images, modernist photography is very clear, everything in focus, lots of detail. Now, Eadweard Weston gets a Guggenheim grant in 1937 to photograph, and he uses that grant to go to areas, particularly Death Valley, and make images. And so what we see on the left is a result of that project. But on the right is a later color image that he made in 1947. And this idea of using color in photography at that point in time for an art photographer is kind of unique. It's not something that was widely accepted, and people actually viewed these images as quite garish. But I think you get a very different view of the space between his color and his black and white images. And most people I talk to would say, oh, the black and white one is much more successful. But I really love how the color image gives you this kind of sense of the space and these kind of alien colors that we don't think of unless you're really familiar with the desert. Excuse me. But somebody who did really make color photography work for them is Elliot Porter. And he used a very high-end commercial product called the dye transfer process, and also silver dye bleach to make images of the spaces. What's really different about Elliot Porter's images is that most people are looking at the grandeur of the space, but his images really focus in on the details. So what am I going to see if I am standing right next to this waterfall? Not what does the waterfall look like as a sublime giant landscape? And he worked with the Sierra Club on a book called In Wilderness is the Preservation of the World. And then the second one, The Place No One Knew. And that the place that no one knew is about Glen Canyon, which ultimately gets filled with water and becomes a dammed up valley. And so he's able to record that before that happens, and before essentially that landscape is destroyed. So really, again, looking at preservation of the land. Just a few more images to finish up kind of the remainder of the history of art in photography in these spaces. Minor White is a really steeped in kind of the emotions that we can put through photography. So you'll notice that his image of the Grand Tetons here, you don't really get the details of the landscape and the mountains in the same way, but again, kind of the awe and wonder of the light in that space. He's very much inspired by Zen meditation, and thinking about the experience of those spaces rather than recording them one for one like somebody like Ansel Adams might be doing. And so this is really about self-expression and the experience of space. And this is important because he'll influence another photographer here in a moment. I'm going to bring back this William Henry Jackson photograph because it was used as part of a project called the Rephotographic Survey Project. I wanted to put that on the slide because it's kind of not a word. But Mark Klett in particular led a project called the Rephotographic Survey Project in 1978-79. And then they go back again and do a third view in the 1990s of a lot of the spaces. They went to 120 different spaces that were imaged in the 19th century. So they would take something like William Henry Jackson's photograph, and they would go and try to find the exact space that he was standing in the landscape and make the exact same view. And what's wonderful about this project, and it is widely accessible online at a website, so you can find it pretty easily. It's also published as a book, but it's wonderful because you get that 19th century establishing view, and then you see what has happened to those spaces. So again, I was speaking about how boardwalks have entered into the space. It really changes the view when you have a boardwalk cutting through the landscape. Another group of photographers kind of in the late 80s, early 90s start to look at these spaces in unique ways. Again, not focusing as much on nature, but more on our kind of awkward ways that we engage with nature. So here we have a Best Western at Mammoth Hot Springs. And what you see through the window, of course, is the beautiful landscape, but you're in this very garishly colored hotel space with this I think it's an elk there on the wall. But Len Jensel, what he tried to do for these images is to approach these spaces like he was completely foreign to them and had no knowledge of them whatsoever, which really his method creates a real sense of fantasy, and he's looking for the non-cliches like photographs of these spaces. So it's really looking at the human elements that we've entered in, a little bit like Mark Klett's project did. And here's another photographer from that same time period, Roger Minnick. This one I think is really fun because it looks like a snapshot at first, but he's clearly observing something, which is this woman's headscarf that's showing the exact same kind of waterfall that's here in the background. So this idea of commercialism and how our desire to be in these spaces has changed them to a point that our relationship to the spaces has changed and our expectations for them. And Marion Belanger also kind of does something similar. She's a resident, she had a residency at the Everglades National Park in Florida when she made this project. And her photographs are both within the park and with just outside of the park. What's interesting is that the just outside the park views are things like this alligator on the right, where you feel like you must be in a national park. And her views of the national park often are these really ugly kind of things and the marks that humans have made on the landscape, like we see on the left. So really an interesting view of like, how do we delineate a line and say that this is a preserved space and this isn't, when the ecosystems of those spaces are so intertwined. Mark Klett, again, in tandem with Byron Wolfe, they went back to a lot of different spaces and used photographs by other photographers such as Ansel Adams and Alvin Langdon Coburn, and reconstructed a full view of those spaces, entering in some of the modern views. And so again, thinking about one space as it is, the Grand Canyon doesn't change very quickly. And so that space, and then looking at it over time, and really time and photography are kind of at odds with each other. Abelardo Morel. I think this is a really intriguing image because he's actually made what he calls a tent camera. So it's a tent that has a little periscope, and that periscope projects the view that it sees onto the ground. And so what we're actually seeing is a photograph of the ground inside of that tent camera projecting the view. So you get the sense of the land that you're standing on, as well as the view that you're enjoying at the same time. And he's made lots of really wonderful images around the world with this technique now. David Benjamin Sherry, whose project recently, he basically is very much inspired by Minor White, as well as Edward Weston. So if you think back to that Death Valley image by Weston, or the one of the Grand Tetons by Minor White, this is very coming out of that tradition. But he turns it on its head because he's not printing it in a traditional kind of color. He's thinking about his emotions and his writings that he's feeling while he's experiencing that space, and interpreting those emotions into a color while he's in the dark room and printing a single color. So while this image is kind of this red and pink kind of tonality, other images are blue, green, yellow, purple, all kinds of different colors. And just one final photographer that I wanted to address is David Emmett Adams. He's quite young photographer, but I love his use of, he goes into the landscape and finds this detritus. And in Arizona, because there's a real lack of humidity, rusty cans don't rust as quickly. So he can go and find those rusty cans out in the desert, bring them home. He puts a varnish on them and then coats that surface with essentially the wet collodion process to make a tintype on the surface of those images, and then goes back out into the desert to record things such as saguaros, or I like the one that's a saguaro about the same age as photography. So kind of thinking about photography and its relationship to the landscape in a new and different way, but also looking at how we as humans have impacted that space. So that is the end of the lecture itself. Again, the book includes over 200 photographs, an overview essay, and all the timelines. And it was a real pleasure to have the opportunity to put that book together. And it's been a pleasure to speak to you today. And Tom and Kristen asked me just to quickly share a few slides of the B. Nettles Harvest of Memory exhibition that is on view at the Krannert through March 6th. For those of you who are in Peoria or in that surrounding area, it's not far away. I think it's currently closed right now because of COVID, but they do hope to reopen, so you can keep an eye on that. This is a retrospective of the work of B. Nettles that I co-curated with Olivia Las Gonzalez, and our museum collaborated with the Sheldon Art Galleries in St. Louis. And it's just a really beautiful look at her use of process, of book arts, of collage, of photography. And it again is not a chronological look. We have a book that does a chronological look at things, but the exhibition itself looks thematically at her work. So again, it's on view from March until March 6th. And if you aren't going to be able to make it to the Krannert, the Eastman Museum has our version of that exhibition up as a virtual exhibition that you can visit. So if you want to kind of look virtually at it, you can go to our website. And that's the book that we made. So with that, I will end my lecture and take some questions. So let me go over to the question.
Well, if you could, thank you, Jamie. If you could stop sharing the screen, actually. I wanted to, thank you. Before we get to questions, I wanted to do three things. One is I did want to thank you. I know some people may have to leave. Thank you so much for such an informative journey through the history of the national parks alongside the history of photography. I haven't quite decided if I'm more jealous because I can't travel right now, or if you sort of fed my need to travel by taking me on that journey, and I'm sure everyone else feels that way. For those of you who don't know, the Krannert Art Museum is on the campus of the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, just about an hour and a half away. So as she said, we could go see that until March 6th once it reopens. And Jamie unwittingly proved a point I made in the September overview of our season, that by building a theme for the year, Bennett is going to be taking us in some circles. And those of you who attended the October lecture, you noticed that speaker talked about Mark Klett and his work with Marion Belanger and showed the same work, Abelardo Morel as well. Yeah, Marion Belanger's work in the Everglades, and then Abelardo Morel and his tent camber. He talked about that. So thank you for bringing that together. And we're going to see more things along those lines. So we do have several questions. Joan Rice asked, when you were talking about the daguerreotype process, you alluded to the use of circles inherent in that process. Can you explain that just a little bit further?
In the daguerreotype process, I probably was talking about its mirror reflection and that it was laterally reversed. So originally when cameras were made, the images as you saw them were flipped. And so later on, we learned to put a little prism in there to write the image as it was recorded. But at the beginning, that wasn't something that happened. So that's one thing that's happened with that particular daguerreotype. And then in addition to that, they have a mirror surface, a very mirror-like surface. So it's essentially a silver plate, a copper plate coated in silver, highly, highly polished, so it looks like a mirror. And then you expose it to iodine and sometimes bromine. And that silver salt on the surface is what makes it light sensitive. Then you expose that to light and you have this kind of really fragile image on the surface of that silver plate that you develop. And then in some cases, you'll use gold to tone it, to kind of harden it, to make it last longer. But what it leaves is that kind of a white, hazy image on a very mirrored surface. So as you look at it, you see yourself reflected in it. And there's a lot of contemporary modern thought about what happens when you see yourself reflected in somebody else's portrait or in a landscape or something like that.
Thank you. While you were talking about Haynes, David Gotcha asked, what would a photo cost a tourist at that time?
That is a good question. And I don't know that I have a good answer for that. I would think, based on what I know about portrait studios at that time, a portrait studio, you might pay 25 cents for a photograph, $1 for a more advanced photograph, $10 for a really fancy photograph. So you're probably looking at, under $1 for several photographs at that moment in time. That's at the beginning of Haynes's studio. I'll note that they went till the 1960s. So, probably later the postcard would have cost you 25 cents or 10 cents or something along those lines.
Cindy Schroeder asks, what role did Native Americans play, if any, when the early photographers were coming to Yosemite Valley? How did they feel about the photographers?
Yeah, a lot of those early exploration projects that I spoke about, they also documented the Native peoples within each of those lands. And that was kind of a separate segment of what was going on. There wasn't any conflict that I read about. I'm sure there were some moments where the Native populations were not happy with people coming to their lands and doing things like renaming the spaces or misinterpreting the names. But there's no real, I wish my colleague were here, Heather Shannon, because she would be able to really give you a good answer to this. But as far as I read, in relationship to establishing national parks, beside the fact that we are taking away land from people, which is never a pleasant thing for a population. There's no real record of any major conflicts or anything.
Tom Romanowski asked, how did you get interested in photography?
Well, my dad, who might be listening right now, had a Pentax K1000. And actually, one of my earliest memories of using it is when we went to the Grand Canyon. Why I'm going to get emotional about that, I don't know. But I always thought it was really fascinating that this camera could record something out there in the world. And so in high school, I took photography and ended up majoring in photography in college, and just enamored at how we want to secure the world in that way. And I was looking down at my notes a lot because my brain doesn't think in dates and names, it thinks in pictures. So I have like this great database of images and no real solid information next to them sometimes. But I think it's just really interesting how we have this impetus to capture and interpret the world in these little tiny moments on paper.
Do you want to mention any of the upcoming museums at the George Eastman Museum, exhibits coming up at the George Eastman Museum that we might watch online if we can't travel?
Yeah, well, right now, actually, I was talking about the clouds in the Muybridge image in particular, and there's an exhibition called Clouds, that focuses on the use of clouds in photography. And if you want to visit it virtually or in person, it's a really beautiful show. It takes you through kind of those early years of how clouds couldn't be recorded and how the different ways that we did record them, but also looks at how clouds are used as poetic metaphors within photographs throughout the history of photography. And then it looks at several contemporary photographers who are using clouds, mostly in that kind of like poetic metaphor way, sometimes as environmental statements and other kind of ways as well. There's been some really lovely panel discussions with some of those photographers too, which will be available on our website as well.
Great. Well, thank you. Those are all the questions that I have here. Thank you again so much for such an informative and fascinating discussion.